think now. It looks like you're feeding.
Oh, okay.
Happy New Year to all.
It's saying, oh, hold on. It's saying waiting.
I think it
Oh,
should be good. Just give it a few seconds.
Yeah, that's it. We're up. Okay. We've got echo coming back, Eric.
Yep, there it is.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, it might be echo on my screen. That's what it's doing. It's okay. It's me. User error. Okay. Hi, Vlodek.
Hi, Cyril.
Cyril.
Before you could make it.
Oh, there he is. Hi, Cyril. Okay. Well, slightly behind. I'll How am I getting strange power?
Been getting a lot of hissing from somebody's
From
mic.
me, is it? Has it gone now?
Yes.
Yes.
Let's go back.
Back. It's a ticking sort of noise, but the ticks are hisses, not just clicks. Stopped again.
Okay.
Okay.
Just bear with one tick. Sorry, Vlodek. I'm going to try and record.
Okay.
It just showed up that recording has started.
Okay, super. Vlodek, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Welcome, everybody, to the second HPCC online conference. It's gratifying to see so many people here coming for our mini-conference. We're delighted.
Oh, sorry. Let me just try and mute everybody. Vlodek, you'll need to unmute yourself. Vlodek, you should be on.
Thank you. Yes. The mute button said you can't unmute yourself, but then there was a separate little window which said you can unmute yourself. Confusing. That's the way it is with all these things, starting way back from the 35, which is confusing as well. Anyway, welcome everybody. I hope we won't be confused. I hope you'll have a delightful meeting. Welcome in particular to Cyril. We're delighted that you're well now and could join us. Hewlett-Packard or HPCC will continue to run meetings like this, but we're also hoping very much to go back to physical meetings. Thank you very much, Mark, in particular, for preparing the meeting and for the slides. This is genuinely a mini-conference, not the one that we had in October, which grew into a very big conference. Greetings to our own members and to guests from HHC and from the Auschwitz meetings and to everybody else. We're now in our 39th year, and we continue to publish data file. As the slide says, Swiss micros and more. I've just received a 41X and I'm delighted with it. Thank you, Godwin, and please pass my thanks on to everybody else involved. The meetings are now twice monthly on Webex, as I said, but at some stage we hope to go back to physical meetings on the second Saturdays and continue on the fourth Saturdays of the month. And here is a link to HPCC and to membership. Now, Thank you again, and over to you, Mark, to run it.
Thanks, Vladik. Can you hear me okay?
Yes?
Super. Right, so etiquette, if you've been on this before, you'll sort of know the score. We're going to try and keep everybody muted just to avoid accidental disturbances. You should have an unmute button. I'll try, and they've changed the options since 2 weeks ago to give me more mute and unmute options than I know what to do with now. So hopefully I will try and get the right ones. You can text chat within Webex. For those who are on YouTube, you can text chat on there. And what we'll try and do is if there are questions coming from the YouTube side, we'll try and get those through to the presenters. You should find in the top right-hand corner of Webex, there's a little icon like this that I've shown here. A little grid icon view probably comes up to start with. When we present, it should automatically show you the presentations and the speaker, hopefully. But you might need to adjust the views if you want to look at a different view, if you want to go backwards and forwards between the grid view and the presentation mode. So have a look for that. The conference is being live streamed unedited on YouTube, and Eric, thanks again for doing that for the big conference in the autumn last year. We'll no doubt edit that and put the individual session presentations on YouTube as well. So we'll try and keep to start with at least the the presenters will present, and we've got time for Q&A. But if Cyril and Eric would like questions while they're going along, then if you let me know and I can unmute people or whatever, and we'll see if we can pick up the chat. So you don't need to be looking at the chat, Eric and Cyril. I'll try and do that for you if that's all right. So we're going to start off with Cyril, who's going to tell us a bit about what's new at HP and what isn't, and then we'll have some Q&A, and then followed by a quick break. So you can get a cup of tea or whatever, and then we've got Eric who's going to tell us a bit about maths and coprocessors before the x86 series, some Q&A on that, and then Vladik and I will just finish off on some things about the club. We should finish around 6 o'clock GMT, UTC, and whatever that is around the world for you guys. Okay, I will just unmute everybody. Get back to where we were. Anybody got any questions? If not, what I'll do, I will try and get the presentation mode over to Cyril. And if you want to share anything with us, Cyril, you should have a share button now that you can use.
Hello, everyone. First, it's been a very long time since I've seen some of you. Faces I recognize immediately, other that I haven't seen so long I didn't even recognize. No, I don't have anything to share. That would have implied that I actually had prepared something, which unfortunately I just did not have the time to do because I've been insanely busy lately. So, yeah, it's very nice of you to give me an hour and some change. I, at this point in time, don't really know how I will be using that hour, to be honest. But I'll do my best to try to keep things interesting, even if it's not always on calculator. Now, whoever is drinking a beer over there, it's not very fair because I'm trying to be, to slow down on the alcohol and, okay, that's not a beer. Okay, I take it. It's not 5 o'clock here yet, so, I'm trying to be good. Especially with the confinement and all of that, it's been hard on everyone. So anyhow, now that I've done saying hi to everyone, what can I talk about? Well, obviously, you're here to listen to me talk about calculators. Unfortunately, I do not have a lot to say about calculators. So, and I'm going to try to explain a little bit why. and then try to talk about what might be happening in the future, although a lot of it is well, I mean, especially going on YouTube, there's lots of things I cannot say. Most of what I would be saying would be what I think and not confidential to HP. So, of course, I can't really talk about the future that much. But as lots of you know, there have been some changes on the calculator side at HP. That's public information. Tim, who's working with me, has relocated to Taiwan. I'm still in Europe, and most of the people we are working with are no longer working for HP. They've moved away, they've moved on. Things have been revamped, remodeled, and all of that. Companies like HP are always in turmoil. Things are always changing somewhere and having effects somewhere else. And calculator are being kind of caught in that because we're small. Calculator is a small thing in a very, very, very large company who does not handle things in small ways. So, I had that discussion with someone a couple of days ago complaining about some big company laying off 10% of their workforce and saying, oh, look at this bad big company. They're just not thinking about people. And I have to try to explain to them how it works. When I joined HP in 98, so 20...
Cyril, I think we're no longer hearing you.
Yeah, I can't hear it.
Neither. Can't hear him.
Well, this is how he can speak of all these secrets inside HP.
Let me see if I can get him back. Hold on.
I think if you mute and unmute him, it should restore audio.
Yeah, I'm trying. Yeah.
Was he censored by HP?
Oh, I hope not.
I think he must not hear us.
Cyril, hi, can you hear us? I can't hear you.
No.
Cyril, on n'entend plus rien maintenant.
Ah. No, that was Godwin, sorry.
If you listen, there is a humming from Cyril.
Yeah.
So there is something coming through on the speakers from him. So muting and unmuting probably doesn't help. There's just a fault. Maybe his headphones aren't plugged in solidly and they'll loosen the plug.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Better.
Okay. I'm just getting rid of the headset, and I'm gonna try to just use the laptop. It means I'm gonna be annoying to other people in the house, so I'll just move away a little bit. Hopla. I'm sorry, I have no clue how long ago it cut off. Can you give me an ID?
You were saying 20.
20 years? Well, yeah, 20 years ago when I joined HP. That's where it was. I need to remember what I said. I don't know. I think I was trying to explain how a large company works and what happened to Tim and I. And the gist of it is large company like HP grow continuously by accretion, buying other company, merging other company, continuously hiring. and then they just do regular cleanup by getting rid of 5%, 10% of employee and just reorganizing things, big turmoils. And Calculator in some ways was caught into that, and Tim and I were told to go do something else. And we said, what about Calculator? And they said, what's Calculator? And we said, well, that's what we've been working on for the last 20 years. And they hear, oh, we do calculators? Yes, we do. And basically we were told, okay, well, you're going to continue working on Calculator on one side and do that other thing, which is important to us on the other side. So what's been happening is we've been doing both. We've been trying to continue calculators and at the same time working on these other projects. And these other projects have all to do with PC accessories. PC accessories, that's your mice, your headset, like the one I was using that's not working, obviously, keyboards, all these things that attach to your PC. And over the last year, as you know, there's been that little virus thingy going around, and the net result is everybody's been working from home, or lots of people, and we've been incredibly busy. Companies like Dell did not go well with the epidemic. And if you look at it, it's kind of funny. They did not go well with the epidemic because everybody wanted computer at the time. And their model, which is kind of a just-in-time, we manufacture when you order, we make the things as you need them, was why Dell was so hard to fight for HP, because they had very low inventory, very low cost. They came up with business models which were great for them, worked very well, meant that they were kicking our rear ends. But the epidemic arrived and they just could not, their supply chain was broken because of the epidemic and people couldn't order from them. Well, HP, we still have the old, mom and pop business model where we manufacture, we sell to, continent-wide distributor who will sell to region-wide distributor who will sell to country-wide distributor who will sell to the local stores, which means that we've got insane level of inventory. It costs us a huge amount of money to manage it. Inventory stuff you've built and haven't sold yet, so it costs money. It's locked capital. It also means when some new devices come along, well, you basically have to scrap the old one because nobody wanted to buy them. But when the epidemic arrived and Dell and the other couldn't produce, we had all the inventory on hand and we sold it and we sold through and we made tons of money. But that also means that everybody wanted a mouse for that new laptop or a keyboard to work from home. And since that is what Tim and I are working on, well, we got very, very, very busy dealing with that. Which means that last year, where we wanted to spend some time on Calculator, well, we have not been able to spend a lot of time on Calculator, unfortunately. So that's the gist of what's happening on our side. We are still working on it. You've seen some of the beta coming around, and we would really like to continue working on putting out some more betas. You've seen apps disappearing from the app stores because, well, they were working. Why touch them? And for some reason, Apple and Google think that if you're not touching an app, it's old, and they remove it. Like, why do you remove something that's old just because it's old if it's working? But no, their principle is it's old. You must change it. Like, why change it just for the sake of changing? So that's roughly what's happening in our life, at least in the corporate life. I don't know really what else to say to talk about that. You've seen the beta coming with Python, so we are working on Python for the Prime. At one point, it will come out, hopefully, whenever we've got time to do it. We'll need some people to test it, so that's when lots of you will be, I hope, joining in and helping us. But that's roughly what's happening to us at this point in time, and we hope 2021 will allow us to do more things and to work on more items, including calculators. So I don't know really what else I have to say on calculators. I mean, after that, I might be able to go in some of the details if you've got specific questions.
Cyril, I think one of the questions that people are interested in is which models are still in production. Are you able to tell us that? Because we've heard various things about ones coming out of production.
As far as I know, the 12C and 12C Platinum are still in production. Prime is still in production. The 10B2 plus second, whatever it's called now, is still in production. I mean, we keep just adding plus and and second and stuff like that on product. I usually don't follow that much on that. The 17B2 plus, I believe, is still in production. The 35S, I believe, is still in production. And the rest, was put end of life a long time ago. So if you look at what we have right now, we basically have three types of calculators. We've got Prime, which is the flagship, and we'll keep working on, and there's no reason that I can think of where we would put it out of production. Bar some big hardware things like, we don't have microprocessor and nobody wants to spend the time to change it, but I don't see why that would happen. We've got the two which are based on the Atmel ARM chip. So there's the 12C and the 10B2 plus. These ones, if tomorrow Atmel was saying, we don't make the chip anymore, we will need to switch them. That's a big project. I don't have the number on sales. As long as we sell enough of them, I'm sure we'll put the work in to change microprocessor. And the two other, the 35S and the 12C Platinum, are on 8051 type chip. They were made by the ODM at the time, and as long as the chips are made, we'll keep making them, I'm assuming. And these chips, there's no reason why they would stop making them. So unless sales fall drastically on these products, I'm assuming we'll just continue making them and selling them. So that's what, these are mostly my guess on these products. Nothing new, nothing that you couldn't figure out by yourself. And I'm saying these things to protect myself. If somebody says, you're disclosing confidential HP information. I don't have any more information than you. I know the processors, so do you. I look at them and I look at the market, and these are my deductions. I'm not really talking about any plans specifically that we have at this point in time. So does that answer your question?
Yes, thanks.
Good.
And the emulators, I know people have raised concerns about those, and that's purely just an admin and time thing. So it's not that you've discontinued doing them; it's more that they've just, for whatever reason, become unsuitable for Apple and Google, and they've dropped them. Yeah.
Yeah, basically, Apple and Google seem to have policies that if you don't touch an app for a year or a year and a half, and it varies, they'll just delist it. They'll just remove it. Because from their standpoint, if something is not being touched on, it means that it's not alive. I don't think that if I was coming to Apple and say, look, we've got that emulator for that HP12C that we've been making for 35 years, it's not changing. Why would we change the app? And they look at us saying, 35 years, that's not possible. Yeah, well, tough luck. I mean, we've got that product we've been making for 35 years. It's been exactly the same for 35 years. We haven't changed it. Why would we change the emulator? And, you know, they'll probably look at us with big Google eyes, or googly eyes, pun intended, and tell us it's not our process. So, you know, and when you don't touch a chunk of software for 2 years, 3 years, you know, 4 years, and you try to pick it up, you realize that, oh, yeah, but that was with 3 versions ago of the compilers and the tools. So it doesn't translate directly. So you have lots of work to pass it to the new libraries. And then you discover that there's some bug there because the libraries have changed, or you've lost compatibility because the new stuff isn't backward compatible with what was before. And you just go down through the rabbit hole of having to upgrade a bunch of stuff to try to find compatible version, which is just a huge amount of frustration just for the sake of saying, oh, we've changed it for nothing. If it ain't broken, don't fix it. You know, they're forcing us to fix it when it's not broken, which means it's going to cause problems. So, you know, all it means is time for us, and time is always hard to get.
Why don't you do what they do, which is resubmit the same product and say, change any ways?
Unfortunately, they want you to recompile it for the latest SDKs and the latest OS, and that's where it breaks down. We would like to just do that, but I did try it on one of the apps, and it wouldn't compile. It wouldn't compile because the SDK, you know, 5 SDKs ago or 6 SDKs ago has changed enough that things break. And then you have to readapt your software to the new and good way of doing things that you've been doing for 20 years. And they've decided, oh, no, you know, we've invented a better way to read files. Really? You know, so
it's not like we care, is it, particularly? Yeah.
Yeah. And of course, we have to do it with, you know, both Apple and Google, or Android and iOS and Windows. And now there's Windows on ARM coming, and there's Apple on ARM coming. And I can guarantee you, if I was to retake the apps and recompile them today, in 6 months they'll delete them, saying, "Oh no, now you need ARM compatibility," as you know, we are removing everything which isn't compatible with all our platforms. If you remember, we had the Prime with 64-bit, what, 5 years ago, 6 years ago for Prime. They, you know, if we did not have a 64-bit version of Prime, they would just remove it on Mac.
You mentioned Python. Python's obviously taking off in education big time, and in lots of software engineering environments. So is that going to be expanded to? Is it just going to be Python syntax within CAS, or is it going to be? Are you looking at full, you know, a MicroPython or?
So there is already Python syntax in CAS. You know, it works. It causes as many problems as it solves, but it is already there. You have seen the beta that was published, a year ago with MicroPython, which integrates within the numerical side of the calculator. So that's a pure MicroPython. As I said, that's already been published, and it's already out there if you get the right version. So that's what we need to do. That's what we're looking at. The problem is, how do you integrate that with the rest of the system so it makes sense? Some of the competitors, well, pretty much all the competitors have Python as a completely separate side of their system. So you just go into Python and you just pure Python programming, just in its little silo. I personally think it is not the right thing to do. And I think that Python needs to be able to integrate so that you have a program that can have both Python, non-Python, cast, and exchange object in between all of that. But of course, that means extra work, and that's not always easy to do. You know, things don't always like to communicate that well. But yeah, I mean, the demo or the beta that was put out a year and some change ago was based on MicroPython. There's another Python which is tiny Python or something like that, which I really like. It's less than 64 kilobytes, but unfortunately, it's like Python 1.0 syntax, and everybody wants to use Python 2 syntax, which is different, and that wasn't supported. So, you know, MicroPython is the only choice there, but the memory footprint, you know, goes from 60K to 1 megabyte, and 1 megabyte isn't small. I mean, the OS or if you look at Prime and if you start looking at the files in the update, you'll notice that roughly the whole system right now with the CAS plus all the graphing engine and the operating system and all the UI is on 7 megabytes. You know, add 1 megabyte for Python, and it's a significant chunk. So, sorry, I got distracted for a second.
Sorry, yeah, I may have missed your MicroPython beta. Where's that available from?
It was a release, a device release that was done a year and a half ago. Eric probably has a copy lying somewhere on HPCalc.
Oh, is it? Okay, it's just me missed it then. Sorry.
It was accidentally released in one of the betas.
Ah, right.
But since it's been released, accidentally or not, it makes it, you know, it means that it's public and that I can talk about it.
Do you want, shall we open to questions from, well, anybody you want to ask a question?
Oh, yeah. And I can talk, you know me, I can talk about anything.
Well, while people are thinking of one, I would be interested. Can you, I've not been to the HHCs, and I'm afraid I haven't caught up with all of the videos, but could you explain what happens in the prime in PPL when you do a check? Does it actually compile the code? And then does it run an image? Is it bytecode? What's going on? Can you explain that for us?
Oh, it does compile. Well, it's not a compilation per se, because it doesn't generate ARM assembly. But basically, it looks at the code, it tokenizes it, and it's gonna generate a tree, an execution tree with objects, a tree of objects, and there is 16 type of object. Give me 1 second. I'm just trying to open source code here, and I can't. I've switched away from the Webex view, so I can't see you. But I'm just opening a Visual Studio because I can probably share or show a little bit of code here and there.
We used to call that semi-compiled.
Yeah, you can call it. I mean, if you think about the HP48, that's basically what it does. I mean, it's going to generate some tokenized structure that it can then execute. In the case of the 40, you could have embedded assembler and you had the whole system with the headers and stuff like that. But in Prime Core, here it is. Source files. And I'm gonna want parser. Where is my file? Copy parsers. Where is it? Oh, here it is. And I'm gonna just want to, come on. Okay. I want that file, and I want mostly Control O, parser.h, and I'm gonna want also prime function 2h. Okay, so let me see if I can do some screen sharing once I'm in the right location. THP where is my THP C program? Okay, back to Webex. Come on, partager, share, écran 1, partager. Okay, is that working?
Yeah, that's coming up.
Okay.
We've got a black screen at the minute.
Tell me why it's not black.
Oh, that's it. Yeah.
We have source code.
See all the code in its glory.
Yeah, some code in all its glory. So there's three main files that I'm working on, which are the parser.h, parser.cpp, and the prime function, 2 include. And this structure here, that hpob, is really, it's one object. It's one object, and the object can be of different types: a real, an integer, a string, a complex, a matrix, an error, a list, an identifier, a function, which is the one of interest, one of the one of interest here, a unit object, a sequence of instruction, a user function, and the other one are a little bit less interesting. And a gen is the CAS type for a CAS object. So really what happened is I'm gonna be generating, when you check, I'm gonna be generating an instruction sequence. An instruction sequence will have user functions in them. And a user function, as you can read here, will have a name, parameter, a sequence of instruction associated with it. And in the sequence of instruction, you're gonna be really finding this first type of object here, either non-executable object, I call this one, or a function, which is really a call to a function. So if you have a program called A, which contains two functions, which I'm gonna call B and C, which have parameter, and B does something like, parameter 1 plus parameter 2, what you're gonna have is an instruction sequence, which is gonna contain one user function called B, which is gonna contain one instruction sequence, which is gonna contain something like a plus function with a parameter, which is going to be also a user function with just the name, with the name of the variable, and a second parameter, which is going to be the name of the second parameter. And then there is a chunk of the program which is going to be dedicated to executing all that. Now there's one trick. Actually, there's a couple of tricks there. First, it's non-recursive. So I can manage memory. Therefore, if you do something like an infinite recursive system, it's not going to crash, or it's not supposed to crash at least, and it should handle that properly. So that's a classic when you implement an evaluator of some type. It's very, very, very easy to do it in a recursive way, but you end up with problem with stack. So you need to do it in a non-recursive way, basically handling your parameter stack yourself. It's much harder to do, but it's much better. That's, of course, how I did it. I mean, it's something that we've known for a very, very long time in computer sciences. Anybody who's worked with Lisp is very familiar with the concept. Nothing new there, but I had to go through the pain of doing it. So that's the first little trick. The second little trick actually is there's two tricks there. One has to do with list processing. So functions, in function definition, it's going to explain in the definition of the function whether it is list processing aware or not. And if it is list processing aware, if the function itself is not list processing aware, then the evaluator, if one of the parameters are list or is a list, it will automatically break it down and do the list, call the function multiple times with the sub-arguments of the list. If it's, one list argument and one not list argument, is going to distribute it. It's two list arguments, it's going to check that it's got the right number and match them one-to-one, etc. So all that's in the evaluator and not in the function itself, which is great because if I create a new function, I don't have to make it list aware. It immediately can do that. So that's something which is a nice little thing. The last trick is that a function can return something to be evaluated in a non-recursive way. Because the question is, how do you evaluate something like a for loop? For loop is definitely something that will need to evaluate something in a repetitive manner before finishing. Well, a function, while it's being processed, can return with an evaluation request, and that thing will be evaluated. So it's going to exit the function evaluation, execute that evaluation, and return to the function, the original function, to continue processing. And that is how I'm handling a non-recursive evaluator. So, the whole parser, the whole evaluator is in these two files. If we look at the parser file, it's just 5,000 lines. And that big file here contains all the user functions. And that's the one which is slightly bigger at 13,000 lines of code. These are fun files to work on or to work with when you're trying to do something. And it's starting to get really big and really hard to get your head around. So did that answer your questions there? Oh, no. Yes. So the original question is what happened when you press check? Well, when you press check, it's going to take your source code. The first thing it's going to do, because in the 39G plus it was still very buggy, is going to save that to Flash and flush the cache. So first thing, it takes your text and it saves it. Second, it's going to parse it, so it's going to create that HPObj structure out of your text. Third thing is it's going to look in your program at application and program global variables. And anyone which doesn't exist anymore but existed before is going to remove them. Then it's going to execute all the assignments in your program, trying to preserve stuff that you've done, but trying to overwrite new stuff. And that was kind of tricky to wrap my head around what needs to be preserved, what needs to not be preserved, especially with app. And that is why we've got program global variables and app variable, which allows to handle that type of situation. And, it's, of course, during the parsing phase, it tries to find errors. And if it finds errors, it's going to show you where they are, or at least give you the line number so you can correct them. There's, of course, things like dealing with things defined in advance. There's all the problem of locality of variables. It's going to try to make sure that you don't use a variable which is not defined. So it's going to have to go through the whole system. If you use a variable, it's going to try to figure out whether it exists or not, whether it exists in your current program, in another program that is accessible, in another app, maybe in an app which is the currently running one, maybe in another app. You've got all the definition stages. So, is it app.something or program.something or not? Did you fully qualify your name? So that's a very critical and important and hard part to implement so that you don't end up having runtime errors. as much as possible, I'm trying to avoid runtime error. That is a very big flow of interpreted languages, and I'm trying to block them as much as possible. So I hope that that ended up by answering the question through presentation of how it works on behind the scenes.
Yeah, so in terms of the performance, then you've not generated ARM assembly language or ARM machine code to execute.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
So that's raw performance that's still interpreting.
Yes.
The object tree. Yeah.
Correct. And even with that, we are significantly faster than the other calculators.
That's astonishingly quick if that's the case, because we were debating this in one of our meetings recently. You must actually compile the code in order to get that level of performance.
So I've thought about it at some time, but I ended up deciding against it. I just did not feel that I was good enough to be able to do that with minimal to no risk of crashing the system or compromising the system. Remember, we've got the exam mode, which is really, really critical in a lot of countries. And it's as much as I wanted to give direct ARM assembly access the way we have on the 49, for example, where I went through the trouble of first putting the entry points to do it and then modifying the Saturn assembler so that it could also assemble ARM code. Here, we just could not take the risk of compromising the exam mode. And that is why ARM assembly is blocked. It's that simple. And coding a virtual machine or coding a just-in-time compiler, I'm good, but it's a huge amount of work, and I didn't feel it was necessary. Now, I've been thinking at some point, especially for things like graphics, to try to have some type of minimal language that could be used for rendering frames of a game. That would be much less powerful than PPL, but that would have much higher speed through things like assembly, direct assembly. But I've never had the opportunity to spend the time to do it, especially, the public of user would have been relatively small.
Yeah, absolutely. It's probably me, isn't it? Just going back to what you said about variables and the ones that were defined already, the global, the app variables, that sort of thing. I've observed an issue with building an app that used the built-in graphing. So I can't remember now which one it was, but anyway. But the syntax of the program, it fails if you download it onto a calculator that has not just run. Is it the two variable statistics? I think maybe it was something like that. Yeah. Does that, so is that purely because the objects have not been initialized? You have to run through that before the program can use them then?
And that's what it boils down to at the end of the day. If I don't know the exact case here. That's the code that does it right here, and it gives you the order here of how it looks for things. Right. And yes, if the variable do not exist in the system, then it will not find them at compile time, and it will not allow you to access them. Now, if you're using something, one of the issues, for example, F1, if you take F1, you'll notice you can access it from anywhere. It's an app variable. So normally, if the app is not the current one, you should not be able to access it. And I was arguing that it should be the case. Technically, it should be the case. But it would have made the life of a lot of people who don't understand that and who are not trying to be proper, math teacher in lots of cases, hard, they would not have gotten it. I don't know how it is in every country, but in France, programming is going to be taught by math teacher. And I did have a chat with one of the higher up and a couple of math teachers about that. And they were saying, oh, there's no problem. We know as math teacher, we know how to be rigorous. And I about burst laughing. Math teachers think they are rigorous. I mean, math people think that they are rigorous. But compared with the software engineer, they're babies. And I'm saying that, I mean, I like math teacher and I do like math. But when you do math, you're interfacing with a human, and the human is able to take context is able to know the context and take that in context, actually. The best example is the equal sign, which is used in math to mean different things, while in computer programming, it's not. You've got different symbol to mean the 3 or 4 things that equal can be or can do. And, that rigor makes it hard sometimes when you implement software, because you do have that internal rigor to your program, because that's the nature of the thing. And then you have to deal with people who are not as rigorous and who do not understand why they have to do function.f1, why they can't just use f1. And so I had to put in place things that I did not like in my program and in my system to handle that. It's the reality of, theory versus, let's be practical. And in the case of most math, math use, it's perfectly okay. They do not need to be as rigorous as we do in programming. And, it's not a problem until we have to work together. And then, practicality versus the way we work can sometimes clash. But anyway, you've got the list here. I don't know if you were able to read it. I know I've published documents that explain that. But, here's the code that actually does it, at least part of it, and how it works.
Thank you. We have a question from Ramon de la Rosa Steins in Spain on YouTube. He's asked, and I suppose it's possibly related in a way, but it's related to CAS. He's asking, is it feasible to have an option to disable in the CAS predefined variables from something? For example, names like VI, B, and theta can be useful for symbolic manipulation. Do you understand what he's asking there?
I'm not sure exactly. And as you know, the CAS is basically, we get the CAS wholesale from Bernard. And we don't have a lot of choice on how to do that. We get his CAS, we put it in, there's some minor changes or some minor adjustment, but that's basically it. So not very easy unless it becomes important for Bernard to have this type of functionality for his CAS as a general rule. Then I don't think we can count on something like that. It's very unlikely that it would happen or be done.
Sure. So, Ramon, you lobby. Sorry. Lost you.
Bernard,
yeah. Sorry. I'm in a complete blank. I'm reading too many things at the same time. Sorry. Thank you.
All of you, call Bernard and ask him or send him an email saying, "Oh, we really want this or that." Maybe he will have it.
Yeah. Does anybody else have some questions? I know on the email the other night we had a great big list, but
I have a question. One of the most common errors or problems that new users to the Prime seem to have, and it seems to be almost universal, is not understanding that I'm not sure the right terminology, but let's call it a system variable or a built-in variable, and they'll start using them. I wondered if a simple way to help people avoid that is if in the calculator display, all system-owned variables were displayed in a different color, so that as they're using them, it would be reinforcing that this is, even though they thought that they created X, it really isn't. It's one that's there, and it would just simply be reinforced by the presentation in a color or some different thing like that.
Yeah, what you're talking about is syntax highlighting.
Exactly.
That's a great feature. That is definitely something that we've been asked multiple times. It's something that we should be working on. It's something which is not that simple for a slew of reasons, and that takes a lot of time. One of the rare, all the data entry, the text entry, it's all the equation writer. And the equation writer is one of the rare things which Bernard or Jeff Tupper, who's done all the graphic, or the mathematical graphic drawing, has done. And one of the rare things which has not been done by one of the four of us is the equation writer. It was done at the beginning of the 39G Plus project, or at least the middle of the 39G Plus project, or Prime, I think, I'm not sure, by a guy called Gérard Squelard. Some of you might remember him. I knew him before I started working for HP. He actually made an equation writer for the 48 at the time. He's the one who made the equation writer that ended up in the meta kernel, which is the program that was made by Jean-Yves Avenard, Gérald, Etienne de Fora, and myself. That's the program that got us hired by HP to start working, and then we did the 49, etc. So a second version of the equation writer ended up there. When the calculator division was disbanded in Australia, Gérald and Jean-Yves started their own company, and they work for TI, among other people. TI? No, Casio? Don't remember. One or the other. And, lo and behold, Gérald made the equation writer on one of these devices. And when Prime came along, Gérald was once again hired to do what he does best, which is the equation writer for Prime. But, that was years ago, and syntax highlighting means going and modifying the equation writer. And it's, I think, 28,000 lines of code, and it's a lot of work to try to understand that. So one day we'll be able to get onto it and spend the time and do it. Don't know when. But definitely, I hear your pain there. I understand. To do it, as I say, you have to have syntax highlighting. And once you have syntax highlighting, the capabilities to actually display it, you need to real-time parse everything to try to figure out what is what. That is not easy either. And will take a significant amount of horsepower and therefore battery power.
Thanks.
Do we have some more questions? I'm sure people must be. I think the other ones, I think we've covered, haven't we? About, I think Bob was asking about which calculators have been discontinued, but I think Cyril's answered that one already.
By default, yes, remove all of the other ones, yeah.
Yeah. Eddie,
Cyril didn't mention at all the cheapies like the 300S Plus. Oh, you did mention the 10S Plus.
No, I didn't mention the 10S. The 10B2.
Yes.
The chippies, honestly, these have always been handled 100% by marketing, and I am not actually following them. I do not believe we are making any of them at this point in time. I might be wrong. Don't take my answer for my word for it there. As far as I know, we are not making them anymore, but I might be completely wrong. We might still be making them and selling them, but it does not go through my hand in any way, shape, or form. So
it doesn't bother you. Would it bother you to try to make a 40th anniversary 12C instead?
Yes.
It would make a lot of trouble for you.
No. I think
it would be wonderful.
I definitely. I mean, it's not every day you have a product that you can say, "Oh, it's a 40th anniversary."
Well, it is.
I think marketing should work on that. It's not an R&D issue; it's a marketing issue.
Okay, you don't have to recertify a product because it's just a different name on the case. Oh, so that will be fairly easy. Well, I suggest it to you.
I'll make sure to pass it on to marketing. I know I did warn them to, a year ago or something that I do not know if they've done anything.
Well, that's some good news. That means that there is a marketing department.
Yep.
Good.
As far as the chippies are concerned, Vlodek can corner the market with the HPCC 4.9G plus.
It's going to be a G2.
Oh, G2. Sorry.
In memory of the Prime G2.
G2 Plus Special Second Edition.
Yeah. With 4 functions, only one of which, 5 functions, only one of which works in reverse Polish, and that's the square root key, isn't it, Vlodek?
That's the one, yes. Yeah.
Don't forget negative. One of my favorite of the chips is the quick calc. I was able to snatch 30 of them at some point, and I just had them everywhere around the house, on the fridge, in the shop. Quick calc is a great little calc.
Got a beautiful display.
Yes. So and it works. I mean, when I go in the shop and it's -5 degrees, it still works, which is great too.
When you were saying shop just then, when you have to say in the shop, I thought you were going to say in the shot.
No.
Not quite the same.
Well, I probably could have some there too, but
yeah, for those not in the know, shot is a French slang word for the toilets.
The privy.
I have a question. Did you take your telescope out to take photographs of the conjunction?
So on the day of the conjunction, the weather was crap and I could not see it, so I was kind of miffed. I was able to see it the next day. It was a little bit less tight, but I did at 300 zoom. Of course, since it was really low on the atmosphere, it wasn't great, but it's great. I mean, I could see the bands on Jupiter at the same time as the rings on Saturn. Couldn't see the Cassini division, but I was fairly happy. So those of you who don't know, I've taken on amateur astronomy over the last 5 years or so. Build myself a little observatory, build myself a telescope, or 5 or 10, or I don't know how many I've built so far, but probably 15 or 20. The last one I've built, actually, I'm going to share it. If I can share a picture, or can I just share? How does that work? Partager. Hop. Okay, partager. And I'm going to put it on. And I know the contrast is not very good on that picture. So that's my daughter next to that telescope. So that's unfortunately not my telescope. a friend of mine asked me to build it. It's a 600 millimeter telescope.
Wow.
It's big. It's 50 kilograms, 55 kilograms. It's a huge telescope. There are not a lot of 60 centimeter, 2 feet telescope lying around, and I just built that one. I delivered it to the guy a little bit before the conjunction. These are my own design. I have fun making them. I made a video about the making of that one actually. So that's one of the things I'm working on at this point in time. It's, of course, me being me, I focus on different type of telescope, at least unusual. One of my nicest one would be this one, and I don't know which one are the nice pictures. So that's a telescope also. So as I say, I focus on things which are unusual when I make telescopes, just for the sake of it, I guess. That's an old wood structure, and you've got the mirror here and the ball at the end. But yeah, so I was able to see the conjunction, not on the day off, unfortunately, but still, still was able to see it. I don't take pictures when I do photography. People who take picture in astronomy are a whole different slew of people. It's a different ways to do astronomy, and it's very, very computer intensive. And I spend my days in front of my computer. It's not to spend my hobby in front of a computer. So, I do visual only, and mostly telescope making astronomy. So one of the things I'm supposed to be working on actually is this one. What is it? CCSD. Where is my file?
Do you grind the mirrors yourself?
What? Oh,
do you grind the mirrors yourself, or do you buy those?
So I have parabolized a mirror that I purchased, which was which was spherical, and I probably got lambda 3, sorry, and I did completely grind a 250 millimeter mirror, and it's just about at lambda 4, so it's not. I am not yet an expert in any way, shape, or form when it comes to grinding mirrors, but I've tried. I spent some time on it. I probably will do some more at one point in time, but it's a very intensive activity, and I haven't spent much time on it. Is my screen being shared or no here?
We're waiting for the content to appear.
I think it's coming up.
It's loading.
Okay.
Oh. I think it's perhaps a bit slow as it uploads the pictures. No, we've just got black screen. Oh, here we go.
So this is a Foucault test of one of the mirror I've been working on. That's a 250. As you can see, I had a problem. So what we're looking at here, tell me when you see the picture.
Yeah, we've got it, the green one. Yes.
Okay, the green one. So for those who don't know, and I'm going to try to explain that here, the round bit is the mirror. And we are trying to see here to test it with little material that you can find in a garage. We are trying to make it accurate to within 50 nanometers, roughly 60 nanometers from edge to edge. So we've got 25 centimeter from edge to edge, and we need an accuracy in the range of 60 nanometer. So most of you are scientific. You can understand the difficulty of things here. And this is done by interferometry, basically. And I shine a light on the mirror, and I try to bring a knife edge from the side. And here you can see the dark area and the light area that tells you which part of the mirror are deeper or higher. And that does give you that accuracy of around 50 nanometer through interferometry. So it's really, really interesting. It's a really interesting activity. It's really crazy to think that in your garage with basic tools, you can grind a mirror with that type of accuracy. And the mirror has to be at least, needs to have an accuracy at least better than 1/8 of the wavelengths of light for things to work well. That's where the difficulty lies and why telescope mirrors are so expensive. One thing I'm trying to do for the local astronomy club, this is a telescope I made for my daughter 5 or 6 years ago. As you can see, it's just a PVC tube, basically leftover from the restroom, les chiottes, comme on disait tout à l'heure, of the house building. And my idea is to make kits of this telescope to have a telescope building activity with kids at the astronomy club. So we could organize, for less than $100, you go, you spend the day, and during the day, you build your own telescope as a kid. You learn how it works, you learn how to tune it, and in the evening, you learn how to use it. So I'm working right now on plans to automate that and how to handle prepping the material for 20 of these things. Working with CNC machine, making the focuser part. You've got some example here of the work. I've got a little CNC machine to do that type of thing, and all the plans and all that to do it in a massive way. Let's put it that way. So here's the answer. Yes, I have grown my own mirrors, but I'm not yet good at it. And I've built my telescope and I observe.
Good. We have some questions. Do you want to? I think you should be able to unmute yourself if you'd like to ask your question about the apps.
Yeah, sure. Going back to the very beginning when you were talking about the emulator apps, I understand the challenge because and I assume and Apple certainly basically leaves apps behind if you don't keep up with the changes that they make to their interfaces. Is there any practicality at all to having HP, if they're going to orphan those apps anyway, open source them so that people who might be interested in keeping them updated with the operating system could do so?
That is an avenue that could be looked at. One of the issue is not all the code within them is HP. As I was saying, I mean, there's obviously the CAS, but luckily enough, the CAS is GPL, so that helps things a lot, somewhat. But we also have some open source things in it. I'm thinking like the JPEG encoder decoder, the PNG encoder decoder, or the zip. And do the license match? Can we use one with the other? These are technical legal questions that are problematic. Some of the code also belongs to Jeff Topper. I'm thinking about the interval engine, which is used for the advanced grapher. So the advanced grapher uses Jeff Topper's interval engine, and that is licensed by HP. So what happens if we try to put everything in public domain? How do we handle this type of thing? There are some legal issues there that will need to be looked at. Definitely, I'm a big believer personally in open, not in well, I'm going to be careful. I'm going to say in source available systems, open source has a level of, the word open source means some type of advocacy and some type of forcing certain viewpoints, as is very well known with GPL. And from my standpoint, as long as people can't take your work and make money out of it, I'm okay. But that's not really the GPL point of view, who has a tendency to want to force people to become open source. That I have more problem with. And I don't know how HP would think about it. But definitely, I mean, if that could be open source or made source available, and we could get some help from the community to maintain these things, less work for me. And definitely, it's a model that has been used by companies in the past. I mean, lots of companies work with open source stuff. Google, has a bunch of things open source. Anybody working with Linux, even large companies, are definitely having some type of collaboration with developers which are not their own. So it shouldn't be an issue in the corporate world anymore. But you still have to go through all the, dotting the I's and crossing the T's, and it's a lot of work also. So if we could get there, great. If we don't, then we don't.
I hear you. It's not any direction you go is going to involve work and devotion of time. And the open source landscape is not just a uniform utopia. That boundary between free and non-free software has always been a rough spot in it.
Yes. Exactly. So I don't know. It's something we would need to look at. I have no clue what HP corporate and/or marketing and/or other stakeholder in HP would react to such an idea. As I said, personally, I've been in HP for a long time. I know perfectly well that companies like HP have a short memory of things they've done in the past. I mean, it's normal. We make things and we put them out and then we move on and then it gets forgotten. I know that if that source code does not make it to the public, when Tim or I or leave the company, it's just gonna be forgotten and nobody will know where it is. I know it is the case because when I joined HP 20 years ago, the first thing we needed was a source code for the HP48, and we tried to find it, and we couldn't within HP. Everything was backed up somewhere. Go figure where. We could not find it. Turned out that one of the ex-HP employees had a copy, which they were not supposed to have. And by then, because the core values division got disbanded, that person got hired by some competitor of us and was nice enough to give us back a copy of our own source code. I mean, our meaning HP source code, because it's very, very hard in large companies. I mean, even if the backup exists, if you don't know where the backup is, you can't find it. And I know at one point I was looking for some documentation. And I was told, oh, yeah, by, an ex-HP employee, it might be Jim Donnelly, actually, or somebody else from that group say, oh, I know, that was on the Scooby-Doo server. I'm here, okay, well, let me look for that. And I tried to contact people in IT. I'm here, okay, well, I need a backup of something which was a Scooby-Doo server. And the guy started doing some search and said, well, I found 58 servers called Scooby-Doo in that time frame. You can't find the stuff there. It's not findable, even if it's backed up. So I know if it's out there and if you guys have access to it, it's more likely to not be lost. And honestly, a lot of it is hours and hours and hours of my work. So personally, I think it would be a good idea. After that, I'm not the one who takes the decision. HP is, and it's whatever is in HP's best interest is what is gonna end up being done.
Thanks, Earl. Stefan, do you, let me see if I can get you off mute. You might be able to get you off mute. You want to ask your question?
Yes, now I guess I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Awesome. Cyril, I'm a great fan of the iPad, and I'm almost always using my iPad instead of my computer, normal computer. And I was wondering some point in time if it's possible to connect physically with a cable the Prime and the iPad. Well, technically it's possible to be able to take screenshots, at least for a first use case, to take screenshots from the Prime. I did a little bit of research, but actually I wasn't very successful to do that, to write such an app. And I was wondering if HP has any plans to do something like that, to support or to write some kind of connection kit for the iPad. But from what I heard today, I guess you're not going any further with apps, right?
No. I'm not saying we are not going any further with app. I'm saying we need to, recompile and put them back on the store because they're disappearing. The links should be there to allow a virtual HP Prime to talk to a real HP Prime, which means that doing a screenshot will probably be feasible, at least through this little bit of user RPL program. Just on the first calculator. Actually, if you take a screenshot on the on your physical calculator, it's what, on P, I think. It gets saved in G9. Don't remember. I think it gets saved in G9, and then you can send G9 as a variable to the virtual calculator on your iPad, and then you can re-display it and do a copy and paste or something like that. But I don't think we've turned on the USB link on iOS. So really what we will need to do is, on Prime, there is an interface layer or a communication octopus at the bottom of the communication layer, which will try to connect through TCP/IP, which is what is used on the iPad. It will try to connect through USB, and it will try to connect also to a local pipe, such as a name pipe on Windows for local, computer to computer, same computer to same computer communication, which is used by the connectivity kit. That code is relatively OS agnostic, and it's supposed to work on every OS, but some of the stuff is turned on and off on various OS whenever it's needed or not needed. And I'm pretty sure it's turned off on iOS. At least the USB part is turned off on iOS. And now really what we will need to do is turn it back on. And then it might just work with some luck. I mean, it's always great when you think, oh, and then, you just turn something on and your code just works and you're here. Wow, damn. But it might be that case. Will I spend the time to do it? I don't know. Definitely next time I put my finger in that part of the of it, I'll, if it comes back to mind, I'll have at least a look to see if I can do it. But I won't guarantee anything.
Okay. Thanks. So maybe just a suggestion for the future.
Working every day, you do lots of very dull things when you work. I mean, you've all had successful careers and all that, so you know that some of the work is great and exciting, and some of it is dull and just boring. And sometimes it's nice to interject a little bit of, craziness or interesting things to do if you've got the time to do it. And sometimes you don't really have the time, but you need it for your, for your brain to be able to take a little vacation. And that definitely fits the bill of that type of thing. So as I say, next time I put my finger in that part of the thing, and if I still remember it, I most likely will at least spend 10 minutes or 15 minutes to see if it's even possible.
Super. Thank you.
I'm sorry, Stuart.
Oh, was that me you were talking to?
I saw a message. Somebody saying he was made redundant.
Yeah, that was me. I was having a quick laugh at the successful careers thing.
So, well, I'm sorry to hear that.
No, it's okay. I wasn't doing it for sympathy. I was doing it more for the comedic value than anything else.
That still hurts.
Yeah, well, onwards and upwards.
Felix, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, very brief one. I repeat this every 2 or 3 years. When I do a calculation with the prime,
I am not going to extend the triangle solver.
No, the triangle solver, I'm not interested. Now, the unit system.
Yes.
Any progress there sort of in the future? Because when I use the prime, I often juggle with units, and I would really appreciate conversions and handling of units in the way sort of like the 50 did.
I understand. Well, the 50, you're more talking about the 48, I'm assuming, or the 50 if you turn the graphic menu off. We have never really found a good way to do it besides going back to something very similar to the 50, which is sad. I really like the 50, the original 48S, I guess. I agree with you. The 48S with the menu like that and the 3 shifts, the unshifted and 2 shifted possibilities was tremendously powerful and quick. And I know Tim has spent a lot of time on trying to find a way to shoehorn something similar on Prime, but we really have not been able to find a UI that fits in Prime that allows us to do that correctly. It's a tough nut to crack. So definitely that's one of the pain points and one thing we'd like to work on, but we still haven't really found a good solution.
If you look at Mathematica or something, they haven't found a good way to handle units either. So it is difficult.
Yes. Yeah.
So I will even come back with a question to 2 years or so.
No problem.
Thanks, Felix. There's a question on...
Maybe in 2 years, that thing is going to be open source and you can do it.
I need to be retired by then. Yes, that's...
There's a question on YouTube. Turge, is it Turge? I hope I'm saying that correctly. Valestada asks, using the prime in RPN mode, will there be a way to return results from functions or programs without having to press enter? I'm struggling to try and visualize that one, but are you any good on that one, Cyril?
I think so. So the RPN mode on Prime was really, as is very visible, added as an afterthought. RPN works really, really, really well on the 50G or the 49G because it matches the underlying system and everything. So it really is a shoe-in because it's just an exposition to the user of what's underneath. It's absolutely not the case in Prime, which obviously, I mean, it's PPL behind. Everything is PPL. And PPL does not really work well with RPN, among other things, the fact the variable argument count on functions. And really trying to shoehorn RPN or RPL or RPN plus, if you want to call it that way, in prime, it's never going to feel natural. And it cannot feel natural because it just is not, it doesn't match what's below. So can we make it better? Yeah. Will it feel the way it does on the 4950? No, it will never. So it's always going to be a disappointment to traditional RPN users. And I'm sorry about that. It's just it's the nature of the fact that it's always going to be an overlay on top of something which is not RPN.
Thank you. Steve, was it Steve? Steve. I can't find Steve to unmute you. Hopefully you can unmute yourself. You want to ask?
This is Steve Tucker. Can you hear me okay, everybody?
Yeah. Good.
Apologise, I'm not on video. I'm on a phone at the moment. There's not enough power to run that. But yeah, my question was regarding the possibility of a socket on the Prime to run third-party code that might have incompatible licenses, so it can't be incorporated perhaps into the main OS. There was something on the forum about Fourier transform, where the author might make the code available, but I believe NumWorks do something similar to allow people to compile their own code, and it's sandboxed away from the main code. Is there any thoughts on that, Cyril?
Oh, it's not sandbox on NumWorks. It's not correctly sandbox, and it goes down to what I was saying earlier about exam mode. Running extra code, it causes problem with allowing people to, giving people access to the rest of the system, and it means that they can potentially break the exam mode, which is a no-no on our side.
Sure, understood.
So that's the main thing. I mean, I know you can do some type of memory protection and things like that. And as we've seen on Intel Windows, even with the power that these big companies have, they're still not doing it right. And it still can be attacked and still gets attacked. And as I say, exam mode, sacrosanct, can't touch. After that, it would be a lot of work because every single function, everything needs to be, SDK needs to be created with all the data structure which are spread around, tens of thousands of lines of code, 100,000 lines of code or something like that. Plus all the functions that you want need to be made accessible through some type of system call. And they all need to be cleaned up and verified to make sure there's no bug in them that can be exploited. Another problem is we work a lot through callbacks. So callback means you give me a pointer to some of your code and I'll call you back later. Of course, that just breaks all securities everywhere. So that will need to be completely reworked too. So it just does not mesh well with security, and that's what's breaking it. We would love to have that type of things. Among other things, to be able to have infinite precision floats in Prime, but the infinite precision float libraries are all under licenses that blocks us from embedding it in Prime. Hence why Prime does not have infinite precision floats. In the same way that the infinite precision integer library that we use, it's MP, I don't remember the name, TomMath, sorry, is what we use, is relatively old and not optimized and relatively slow, but that's the one we can use because that one is fully open source, is source available, do as you want type thing, while the other ones we would like to use have licenses that blocks us from using them in Prime because of none of these. Most of these open source licenses have been made for computers, never thinking about the embedded world. And in the embedded world, everything is compiled, linked it's linked at compile time to make a single executable, and you don't have dynamic loading and things like that.
Right, thanks, Cyril. That's a good comprehensive answer. I guess I can see all the difficulties. I guess this is something that Swiss Micro's also faced, and they came up with a solution of having to separate all the different licensed codes to meet the demands of those.
Yeah, as I said, the last nail in the coffin for us is the absolute protection of the exam mode.
Sure.
That's something that Swiss Micro does not have to deal with.
Thanks, Cyril.
Thanks, Cyril. Just following up on that, and the protection of exam mode, would it be possible to have a function to allow program input-output over the serial, maybe just console type level, because in an exam mode you're not going to have students that are connected there in an exam. You're not going to have them plugging things in, so that surely wouldn't compromise that, would it?
Correct.
So can we have input-output, please?
So the calculator, so on Prime G1, no. Because the operating system, which is Besta, is not in our hand and is limited to USB slave and USB host with another Prime, and that's it. It cannot support any other type of HID or VID PIDs, basically. On Prime G2, which is fully and 100% under our control, yes, definitely we can do. We could do this type of things. I don't know if you've noticed, but if you take a USB hub and plug it on Prime, and then plug a Prime in that USB hub to connect to your Prime, it will work. At this point in time, the code isn't great and can only connect with one device at a time, one HID device at a time. But definitely, there's much more flexibility there, and you could imagine some type of PPL function that allows you to query the USB system to know if you're connected to something else. And if you're connected to something else, the packet know the USB packet size and send and receive. Now, that would only work if it's a HID device, if it's a vendor-defined HID device. I guess it could work with mice and stuff like that. So only with HID devices, and you should be able to do send and receive of USB packets. So we could think about some ways to add a couple of PPL functions that would do that.
Yeah, that would be quite cool. Yeah.
Yeah.
But your issue there is that you're making it G2 specific, I suppose.
It would be G2 specific, yes.
Yeah.
I just do not have the control on the operating system I need in G1 to do so. So the function would probably still exist on G1 just to make sure that programs still compile, but they would be inactive.
Yeah. If you could add that while you're tinkering with the code, adding units and screen dumping, then that'd be great.
Yeah. Well, I guess that would give you access to screen dumps.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think. Does anybody else? I think I've done all the questions that I've found on the chat. Does anybody else have one? You should all be able to unmute yourself one at a time.
I had one final comment. I spoke to Richard Nelson on the phone last night. He said to say hello to Cyril and everyone else. He also asked, as Cyril properly anticipated, if the triangle solver has been extended in any way. I'm happy to tell him no.
You know, that whole triangle solver has been done fully for one purpose, is to get one single person to just shut up. And once the triangle solver was there, that person just kept asking for more. So
This is nature.
The triangle solver, and there is actually a note in the source code saying, you know, this is there solely because it was asked by Richard Nelson. But I mean, I love Richard. He's a great guy. And the triangle solver is something I use a lot in the shop. It's a great little app. It's really useful. So I mean, but you know, if I can make fun of Richard through it, I'm not gonna stop myself from doing so.
How's Tim doing?
He's doing okay. He's happy in Taiwan, so.
And Bob, you want, was it Bob? I think wants every surveying program implemented on the Prime as well, don't you, Bob? Was that right?
Yeah, just built in. I'll do that after a couple of hours before bedtime. So.
I think Bob was it Bob complaining vigorously about he never wants to see another surveying program?
It was Bob saying he doesn't ever want to see another surveying program ever again. However, that's the lifeblood of many of the products that we have at this stage, so we can't really complain about them too much.
I know. So, guys, I'm going to have to get going because I need to go, and I'm supposed to bring a kid back to his parent and get my kid back from wherever that he is or she is. So I wish you all a very good rest of the day and lots of fun, and hopefully I'll be able to join you another time on one of these conferences.
Brilliant. Thank you, Cyril. It was great to have you. You're bang on time as well, so we're going to have a break now till 5 o'clock our time, local time in the UK. So 15 minutes to grab a drink or whatever, and then we're back with Eric.
No
Thanks,
problem.
Cyril. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.
Godwin.
Yeah.
During this pause in the action, wanted to chat something briefly through, not secret, so anyone else can listen. I heard from Minder Coopers last night. He is the author of the MLDL 2000. He is creating a new version of that software for manipulating ROM images and so forth. The same features that are in MLDL, but without the hardware concerns in it. And one of the things he's considering, you know what? Is this being captured? Is this being streamed? Interesting. Maybe this shouldn't be done through here. You know what? I'll reconsider that. I'll have to talk with you offline on going with it. 'Cause I don't. It's not like it's state secret or anything, but I don't want. It shouldn't be my decision to discuss publicly something that he's doing. So
Fair enough. Yeah, no problem.
I want to talk with you at that. But the question really comes down to: is the file format for the D41 file documented at a low level?
The file format for the DM41X. You mean the
D41, like if you save the memory image.
Ah, right. I don't think there is any documentation as such about it, but it is pretty straightforward.
Well, he said the same thing. I think it's straightforward. My experience is straightforward ceases to be true when you find something that isn't in the straightforward stuff. But that's just scars from past projects, maybe. But anyhow, I'll follow up with you offline.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Jake, you have a good holiday?
Yeah, so far so good.
Excellent.
How's your weather there?
It's cold today. It's below 20 today.
Wow. We're in the 30s.
I think I heard there's another storm coming through early next week, something, right?
Yeah, something like that.
How much did you get last time?
As far as snow?
Yeah.
Not a whole lot, maybe 3 inches.
Oh, we got probably about, I don't know, 16, 17 inches.
Whoa.
But it melted and got, it went away pretty quick. It wasn't too bad.
Well, good morning, everybody.
Hey, Gene.
Sorry I'm late. I just got back in from getting my father his first Pfizer COVID vaccine shot this morning.
Yeah, good for him. Good for you doing it.
Today was the first day in Nashville, Davidson County here in Tennessee, that they had opened up vaccines for the general public, anybody 75 years and older. They were the last county in Tennessee, pretty close to it, there may have been 2 or 3, to do that because they had so many healthcare workers and first responders that they needed to get the vaccine to first. They were prioritized ahead of people 75 and older. They opened it up earlier this week, and my sister spotted it, and we got him into the first 2-hour window. We were really quick.
Wow.
And we weren't sure until we went through the line, we weren't sure whether he was getting Pfizer or the Moderna, but it was a Pfizer shot.
Hey, Gene, my mother-in-law lives over in Trousdale County, and she got her first one earlier this week, and she's 97.
Great.
God bless.
They were doing, they had been doing parallel to the first responders, older people who were in nursing homes or health facilities, because they are at very, very high risk, more than somebody who's older and on their own, because they can't isolate nearly as easily. And other counties didn't have as many first responders, and so they had opened up to 75 and older before Nashville had. Teachers as well have also been getting it. But anyway, we got him his first shot. My son had his second shot earlier this week. He's a doctor down in Memphis. His wife, who is a pediatric intensive care nurse in Memphis, also has already had her second shot. Pfizer, you take whichever one you're offered. Pfizer does not offer as much protection as fast as the Moderna, according to the analysis. But by the time you've had the second shot, they're pretty indistinguishable. 95%-ish protection. So all will be good. We're going to keep Dad isolated another 3 weeks. He won't notice that. He's already been isolated for 8-9 months. But all good. So anyway, I got here just in time to hear Cyril say goodbye.
So does the provider of the first shot need to be the same manufacturer as the second?
Yes.
Or can you mix and match? Okay.
They gave us an appointment to return to the same health center in downtown on 3 weeks from today to get that second Pfizer shot. If it had been Moderna, I think they're putting 4 weeks apart, perhaps. I don't know. But
the UK says that they're considering doing mix and match only if they don't have sufficient availability to do the same. But all of the vaccination experts say no, because that doing a combination like that has not been tested for efficacy, and there would be no guarantee. Well, I mean, there's no guarantee, but there would be no expectation with that would necessarily give you the same amount of protection as doing what has been tested, which is 2 of the same.
Well, the Pfizer and Moderna are both using the messenger RNA approach, and what AstraZeneca is not. It's using the more traditional. I haven't been watching that since that's been over in the UK. I knew it wasn't going to be here in the United States. I don't think it's using messenger RNA, is it?
Oh, no, they're not. Even mixing Pfizer and Moderna is not recommended because they have not been tested that way, and they're not identical, even though they're both mRNA.
The Oxford one uses a neutralized monkey virus with a genetic change to it to generate the right type of spike to trigger the response.
Here in the U.S., there's also been talk of administering only a half dose of the Moderna, and again, the experts all say no, that's stupid, and what should be administered is what's been tested in the phase 1 through 3 trials. One common bit of misinformation, by the way, the phase 3 trials, contrary to everything that the media has reported, the phase 3 trials are ongoing and will be until sometime in 2022. They are not completed. The emergency use authorizations were based on preliminary data from early in the phase 3 process. That's why it's an emergency use authorization and not a general approval.
In theory, after one has received both inoculations, could you still be a carrier to others?
It is unknown, but it's believed that may be possible.
Yeah,
you can get a very light case of COVID that your body will be fighting off quite effectively with the vaccine. It should not be a terrible dose because your body's got all the stuff in it to go boom. But any kind of light case you may have could still potentially be shedding particles, virus particles to people around you. So that's always possible, hence the need and the desire to vaccinate as many people as possible. So even if you have someone who is an unknowing carrier, everybody they might expose would also have a light response.
So I always have a mental image of Pigpen from the Charlie Brown.
That's exactly it. I used that image at work when we were talking about COVID. Pigpen. My son, after his second dose, he had it in the morning. Later that evening, he began to feel ill. He had chills, was tired, and achy or whatever, but he had a pretty good response. And so he was very happy to have that. That meant his immune system was really pumping up. My daughter-in-law had less of a response, but when he had been in the trial, he had been in the initial trial for the Pfizer vaccine. He recognized as a doctor he was having no response at all to the 2 doses. So he was hopeful, but pretty sure he had the placebo, and it turned out he had. And so he got the first doses of the Pfizer before they were giving them to the doctors, as he was opting out of the trial to go ahead and get the real thing.
So there are 2 misconceptions about all this that everyone should be aware are misconceptions. And one is that after you've been vaccinated, you still need to practice social distancing and wear a mask and take all the standard precautions that we've been taking. Because yes, the vaccines have shown in phase 3 to be 95% effective. That means they're 5% ineffective. And so what that means is that until we have, given that they're 95% effective, we need about 60% of the population to be vaccinated before it's guaranteed that the distribution of the virus starts going to zero, at which and it becomes safe then to reduce the precautions. And the second thing is that the 6-foot separation, at least in the U.S., that's what we're told to do, is better than a lesser amount, but it by itself that doesn't protect you very much. And the thing to think about is suppose you're a non-smoker and you're in a restaurant and somebody 6 feet away from you is smoking, and you will smell that smoke, and it will, if you're like me, it'll bother you. Well, the airborne virus is the same thing. If you can smell somebody's cigarette smoke from 6 feet away, you can get some of the virus from 6 feet or more away. So everybody, please do continue using masks. They are effective.
And a mask does not trump, or I guess that's a bad word to use these days. A mask does not overpower an enclosed space. In my office, we had an outbreak where 10 of the 130 employees caught it because we had an unknowing person who was virus positive in an office room that was 10 by 10 with 2 or 3 other people. And even though wearing masks in there for 30 minutes, too many virus particles were out and about. So it's like the old in accounting, it's cost, volume, profit. It's time, it's exposure, and it's amount of space. And so it all worked against us in that case.
Exactly. The mask does not offer perfect protection in an enclosed space. It's not. You're going to have more problems whether you have a mask or not. But if the people had not had masks, there would have been a higher number that would have been infected.
Yep.
So has anyone commented officially on, is the government tracking who has and who has not taken it, so that in the end there's some accounting of those who have refused to participate?
We had just, I mean, we signed in, they took Dad's ID, so they know his driver's license number. The question is whether government is competent enough to keep track of all of it. Given how mail is routinely not delivered to my house, even though the tracking said it was, I have very little confidence in government efficiency. Apologies to any of you who may work for the government. It's not like private industry. Amazon misdelivers things too, but who knows? They have the information. Whether they can keep track of it remains to be seen.
I just haven't heard much discussion about it, and I'm sure that's because we're still trying to get the few percent that we can get out there. But once we cross the threshold of it's plenty available and most of the people have had it, there's going to be some trailing end of the curve of people that refuse to participate because it's a plot and all the other crazy stuff.
No people.
I can't help but feel that
if there's a microchip, there's too much information on the internet, a great deal of which is a bunch of crock. Or it's going to make you sterile. That's the latest thing that's been going around, that the vaccine will make you sterile.
COVID might, but the vaccine will not. There actually is some evidence that COVID infection can have that effect.
So, hey, if that's the case, then you will save money. People would save money on birth control if they're planning to do that by getting sterile from the vaccine. Look for a positive somewhere.
The other ridiculous one going around is that the vaccine can change your DNA, and that is false also.
Presumably people are more concerned about becoming sterile than dying.
How's that way?
We learned that at our Capitol building, that teaser set to neuter will also have that effect.
Anyway, we better get on, hadn't we? Yeah. Eric, how are you doing? Are we good to go?
Yeah.
A lot of hour.
All right. Shall I begin?
Yeah, please do.
All right. Make sure.
I don't know if everybody's. Don't seem to be so many people on video. I don't know if that's because they've turned them off or if they haven't come back yet. But
All right. Can everyone see my title screen?
Yep, looks good.
Yes.
Okay, so talking about, as this says, math coprocessors before the x86. So I apologize that one, this is only peripherally related to calculators. You'll see the calculator connection partway through this. Two is that I do not have any pretty photographs or diagrams or anything like that. So this is just going to be text with a lot of bullet points. And with that said, I guess we're ready to go here. So almost everybody has PCs or Macs or whatever now, and most of them have x86 processors in them, except the latest Macs use ARMs. And everybody's accustomed to, in general purpose computers, whether they be Mac or PC or whatever, that they don't even have to think about floating point. That's arithmetic. That's now built into the processor. You don't have to buy a floating point coprocessor anymore like you did 20 years ago. But before the x86 and the 8087 floating point coprocessor that came with that, there were various other math coprocessors. And so I'm going to talk about those. I'm going to give an introduction to the basics of floating point arithmetic first. This is probably old hat to everybody here, so sorry if this is at too elementary a level. Then I'm gonna preface the coprocessor part with what floating point hardware existed in computers before the microprocessor revolution, and then I will actually describe the early floating point math coprocessors. So floating point provides a way to approximate real numbers. There is no way in a computer to represent the vast majority of real numbers, but we can provide approximations spanning. Part of the motivation of floating point numbers, as compared to say integers or rational numbers, is that we want to be able to represent numbers in a very wide range. So typically, floating point allows 75 or more orders of magnitude of range in your numeric representation. Only a limited precision. Now there exist, as Cyril mentioned earlier, there exist arbitrary precision math packages, but your normal floating point arithmetic representation usually has less than 20 decimal digits of precision, sometimes a lot less. Single precision is only around 6 digits. And again, unlike the arbitrary precision arithmetic libraries, normally floating point numbers are represented using a small number of bits in memory, so often 32 or 64 bits, which would be 4 or 8 bytes, respectively. So the most common floating point formats used are either binary floating point, which is radix 2, or decimal floating point, which is radix 10. And computers mostly use radix 2, and that is because the hardware is simpler and faster. Calculators mostly use radix 10, as all of us who've used HP or even TI or pretty much any brand of calculators know. So in either radix, whether it's binary or decimal, there are common fractions that cannot be precisely represented. For instance, 1/3, as everybody knows, in decimal is going to be 0.333, etc., repeating, and so there's no exact representation in decimal. And the same is true for 1/3 in binary, and that is because 3, the denominator, is relatively prime to the base of 2 or 10. If we had, hypothetically speaking, a base 3 floating point number, then we could represent 0.3 exactly. So in particular, calculators use radix 10 because humans generally use base 10 for number representation, and we would like to be able to represent negative powers of 10, like multiples of 0.1 or 0.01 or etc. We'd like to be able to represent those exactly. From a numeric analysis point of view, it doesn't matter whether so much whether those are exact or not. But if you punch in 1 divided by 10 on your calculator, you really probably want to see 0.1 and not some other approximation of that, like 0.099999. So a floating point number consists of 3 parts. There's the sign of the value, because we might want to represent a positive or a negative number. There's the significand, and most people are not familiar with that term, and it's often referred to as a mantissa, and that is incorrect. That the word mantissa has a very specific mathematical meaning that has almost nothing to do with floating point arithmetic. So the correct term is significand. The significand is the significant digits of the number, and in a floating point number, the bounds of the significand are very specific. It's essentially a floating point number. The significand always has exactly 1 digit left of the decimal point, or the radix point, I should say, since it could be binary, and that digit can't be 0. Then there's the exponent, and the exponent is an integer value that represents a positive or negative power of the radix. So base 10, your exponent. Well, for taking the HP calculators as an example, the traditional ones allowed an exponent range of -99 to +99. More recent ones, some of them are -499 to +499. So the absolute value of the floating point number, which means I'm not considering the sign, which was separate, is the significand times the radix to the exponent power. So if my number is, for instance, 6.02 times 10 to the 23rd, which is Avogadro's constant in decimal floating point, then the 6.02 is the significand, and the 23, the 10 to the 23rd, 23 is our exponent. In floating point representations, 0 normally has to have a special representation because, as I said previously, the significand can't actually be 0. So there'll be some other value in memory that is used to represent 0. So a little bit of snarky comments here. While floating point numbers are supposed to represent real numbers, an IEEE single precision float can represent 0% of the real numbers within its range. Essentially do a first approximation, none of them. Obviously, it actually can represent some real numbers, but 0% of the possible real numbers in that range. So if we go to a double precision floating point number, that can represent 4 times as many values, which brings us up to still 0% of the real numbers within the range. This is of course useless information because obviously floating point values actually are very useful to us. But for comparison, if I have an integer type in a computer, well, that can represent 0% of the integers also, but within a specific range, like let's say for a 32-bit integer, basically from -2 billion to +2 billion, within a given range, that integer data type can represent 100% of the integers within the range. Someone on Twitter commented when I made some mention of this that floating point numbers are really just 2 small integers in a trench coat pretending to be a real number. And although that sounds kind of flippant, that actually there's a lot of truth to that. So history of floating point. The earliest computers that had a hardware implementation of floating point arithmetic were actually electromechanical, not electronic. Now, this doesn't go all the way back to Babbage's day, but it goes back to 1938. Konrad Zuse designed and built the Z1 computer, and it used a 22-bit binary floating point format and performed arithmetic on that. It did the common arithmetic functions: add, subtract, multiply, divide. This was built out of relays. That was the start of a series of computers that went beyond this, but the Z4 was the culmination of his electromechanical computers. It was actually commercially sold, although not a huge number of units, and still used binary floating point with a 32-bit format. So the Zuse computers are not really considered, they were pioneering certainly, but they're not really considered to have had a huge effect on the history of general purpose computing overall. Not at the time, not very many people knew about them. So people know about ENIAC, they generally don't know about Zuse. So electronic computers, as opposed to the electromechanical, were fast enough that you could implement floating point arithmetic entirely in software. So if your computer only provides you integer arithmetic in hardware, you can just write subroutines to do floating point arithmetic. So that saves you the cost of building the floating point hardware, which back when you were using individual vacuum tubes or transistors, that cost was substantial. And it still yields adequate performance for a fair number of tasks. But if you're doing something compute intensive, if you're calculating well, just about anything that you would do a lot of calculation, then it still is advantageous if you can have floating point hardware, because it's typically on the order of 100 times faster than implementing floating point in software. So the first electronic computer that had floating point, as far as I know, and certainly the first mass-produced one, was the IBM 704, which was also known as the defense calculator. It was built with tubes. It was a huge machine. I'm sorry, the 701 was the defense calculator. The 704 was essentially IBM's second big scientific computer, both with vacuum tubes. The 704 was essentially the kind of computer that Tom Watson was talking about when he said that he thought there might be a world market for perhaps as many as a dozen computers. People have given Watson a lot of flack for that comment, and it's because the comment's taken out of context, that Watson wasn't saying there was only a world market for 12 computers of any kind ever. He was saying that the market for expensive, gigantic electronic computers was small, and that was absolutely true. By 1969, the IBM 1620, which was a transistorized computer, is an example of a computer for which floating point hardware existed, but it was not standard. It was an option that you had to buy separately, which is more similar to the coprocessors that we're going to talk about. By the 1970s and 80s, many mini computers offered optional floating point processors, and they still consisted of a lot of electronics, so it was an expensive option. So if you didn't need high performance floating point, then you didn't buy that. By comparison, though, the really big computers like mainframes, floating point was still standard. So getting to calculators, the HP 9100A desktop calculator used radix 10 floating point, and that was essentially hardware, although microcode was involved as well. Now, in real high performance floating point, everything is implemented entirely in hardware. There's no real microcode to speak of, or very, very little. But using a combination made it much more cost effective. They couldn't actually build a computer that size that implemented floating point entirely in hardware at that time. And for a calculator, now the 9100A was programmable, but it was essentially typically manually operated by humans, and so the actual speed that it executed a division or a trig function wasn't all that important. It was a reasonable trade-off to use microcode and not have it be quite as fast, but make it compact and inexpensive. I say inexpensive, of course, it was still thousands of dollars, which in 1968, started approaching the price of a car. Then 4 years later, 1972, as probably everybody in this group knows, the HP 35 was HP's first handheld calculator. It was also the world's first handheld scientific calculator. Still used radix 10 floating point for reasons discussed earlier. And in this case, the floating point was implemented almost entirely by microcode. So the hardware really did only provide integer operations, but it had some special characteristics to make implementing floating point on it more efficient than if it truly only had integer arithmetic. So fast forward a few more years to 1978, Intel announces the 8086 microprocessor. This is the forerunner of basically all modern x86 personal computers. To this day, if you buy an Intel, Core i7 or something, it still can run software with certain limitations, software that was written for the 8086 back in 1978. Okay, in 1980, Intel announced the 8087 numeric coprocessor, and this was designed for use with the 8086, implemented floating point in binary, and it used a draft standard floating point format. We'll get to the standard later, but the key thing here is that Intel was actually involved in developing that standard, and they were using the draft before the standard had actually been ratified. And so there are minor differences between what the 8087 supports and what the final standard did. So year after that, IBM introduced the IBM personal computer. And so most of us now use computers that are compatible with it, trace their lineage back to that. Used the 8088, which was a 8-bit wide bus version of the 8086, so not exactly the 8086, but very, very close. It was, as far as I know, the first computer that had a socket on the motherboard. Well, I shouldn't say first. The first really common computer that had a socket on the motherboard for a numeric coprocessor. There were a few kind of less well-known computers before it that were 8086 based and would accept an 8087, but IBM, I think, gets credit for popularizing that. Okay, 8 years later, Intel introduced the 486 processor, which was the second 32-bit processor in the line. And although they offered some versions that it was disabled, the 486 was the first mass-produced microprocessor that actually had floating point as standard. You no longer needed a coprocessor. It effectively had the coprocessor built in. So I mentioned the standard. The actual IEEE 754 standard for binary floating point was in 1985. It was ratified. There had been a lot of fighting over the details because different vendors wanted to use their own standard. DEC really wanted to push VAX floating point as the standard, and the IEEE committee that came up with the 754 standard, the proposal, which ultimately was adopted, was interesting in that they had very good rationales for everything they did. And so to the extent that it was different than VAX floating point, it was different for good reasons, not just because, you know, we don't want to adopt some vendor's existing standard. Part of the pushback against adopting 754 was it was viewed as essentially being the Intel standard because Intel had participated in the development. But ultimately it was ratified, and now almost all modern computers use that. So single precision has a range of, you know, it's about 7 digits precision and range of about 10 plus or minus 10 to the 38th. Double precision, 15 digits precision, range of about 10 to the 1022nd, which if there's any commonplace need for floating point numbers outside the range of plus or minus 10 to the 1000th, I have not ever heard of it. There's also potentially an IEEE extended precision format, which has even more precision, and actually the x86 processors, the floating point supports the extended precision. IEEE didn't specify the exact details of extended precision, but the Intel format is 80 bits. And more recently, the latest standards actually offer a quad precision or 128-bit format. So 1987, because not everybody wanted binary floating point, there was the IEEE 854 standard for radix-independent floating point. It wasn't necessarily specifically decimal, although that's the only form that I'm aware of anybody implementing. And there may have been other implementations, but arguably the most famous and popular implementation was the HP71B handheld computer. So this was a handheld computer that primarily ran BASIC, although it had a calculator mode as well. It was the first product to use HP's Saturn processor, which later became more famous for being in the HP 28 and 48 and related models. So it did use the IEEE 854 draft standard. It fully implemented the standard, had 12 significant digits and a range of plus or minus 10 to the 499th. So many other HP calculators have since used code from the 71B, although they tended to drop some of the features that were not needed because the calculators generally didn't need full IEEE 854 compliance. And more recently, in 2008, the 754 standard was revised to include decimal floating point. Depending on what sources you look at, there are claims that 754 includes all of 854. I'm not entirely sure that that's correct, but it does include decimal floating point. So now we can talk about early floating point coprocessors. So the earliest ones in the mid-70s were based on calculator chips. Now there were some hobbyists that actually took real calculator chips. You know, by that time, a calculator, early electronic calculators, including handhelds, had multiple chips. But by the mid-70s, calculators were primarily a single chip, although in some cases they also had a display driver chip. And so there were hobbyists that interfaced those to microprocessors in order to get floating point. Now, at that time, let's say 1975 to 77, hobby microcomputers did not have very much memory, maybe a few kilobytes of RAM. And so if you loaded up your RAM with floating point routines, then that didn't leave you any RAM for your own software. So if you interfaced a calculator chip, then which were inexpensive by then you got floating point without using up your memory. So TI and National Semiconductor said, oh, well, our calculator chips are essentially a very small 4-bit microprocessor that's been programmed to be a calculator. We can modify that firmware to make it easier to interface, instead of to an LED display and a keyboard, to interface to another processor. So that was the birth of floating point coprocessors, at least as chips that someone could buy. Calculator chips are very slow. So arithmetic functions might take 10 milliseconds, and a transcendental function might take as much as a second. Again, not too bad. You're using your calculator and you punch cosine, and if you have to wait a significant fraction of a second, well, I guess now in the 21st century we would be annoyed by that, but in the 70s, it was amazing that you could do it at all. So people didn't complain too much if it took a second to compute a sine or cosine. So as far as I know, the first floating point coprocessor of this nature was in 1976, a Texas Instruments TMS 1018 number cruncher. There's no technical documentation on this chip known to still exist. The internet barely even knows of this chip. There are mentions of it in some TI general microcontroller documentation. Because of the time it was introduced and what TI was doing in calculators and microcontrollers, this is presumed to be a mask-programmed version of a TMS 1000 microcontroller, which was a 4-bit PMOS part. And today, everybody uses CMOS circuitry for everything, but there were a lot of other logic families and semiconductor technologies in the past. And one of the earliest ones for digital integrated circuits was PMOS, which stands for P-channel metal oxide semiconductor. And PMOS was easy to manufacture, but is very, very slow. In 1977, National Semiconductor introduced their floating point coprocessor, which was an MM57109 number-oriented processor. So this was based on their 5799 microcontroller, which had also been used in some calculators. That was, it was a single chip microcontroller with a pretty limited amount of ROM and RAM. It was also PMOS like the TI, so very slow. PMOS also runs on different voltages than more modern processes. So mainstream microprocessors at that time, like the 8080 or Z80 or 6502, were NMOS. And NMOS was mostly TTL compatible, and PMOS chips tended to only be partially TTL compatible, if at all. So interfacing was a little bit more complicated. And also because it was, fairly crude early technology, that some of the timing requirements were difficult to meet. So hooking up a 57109 to your microcontroller to get floating point was not entirely a panacea, and it was not necessarily really easy. As I said, very slow, but it may still have been cost effective. As I said earlier, it reduced the amount of memory that you needed on your main processor. That, because memory sizes expanded rapidly and costs went down rapidly, this trade-off was not a good one for very long. But in 1977, it was not bad. The other thing about the 57109, as compared to some of the others, is that electronic hobby magazines ran articles about it, including Radio Electronics and Byte. And so hobbyists built some of their own interfaces to this chip, either based on information in those articles or just designing it from the data sheet. And Southwest Technical Products, which was an early pioneer of 6800-based microcomputers, offered a kit that plugged into their backplane of their microcomputer and had this chip. And they also had some software to help use it. In 1980, National introduced an updated version of it, the 57409, they called a super number cruncher. It was not pin compatible, wasn't a drop-in replacement. It was NMOS, so it was a little bit easier to interface. And that was essentially the last dying gasp of calculator chip-based floating point processors. I'm not aware that this was designed into any products at all. I suppose it must have been, because I was able to buy a few of these chips from a reseller, but they're very uncommon. All these chips are uncommon now, but as far as I know, this one was uncommon even back then. So for comparison, if we look at DEC low-end mini computers, there was the PDP-1103 or LSI-11, and the PDP-11 was a family of mini computers introduced in 1970, and it spanned a broad range from low-end, slow, and relatively inexpensive mini computers to fairly large and expensive high-performance ones. The 1103 was the low end of the range. That was the first one that was built based on custom VLSI chips, which were made by Western Digital for DEC. And they offered this KEV11A chip, which was a floating point chip for the 1103. Well, it's not really a coprocessor, it's just a microcode ROM. It added floating point instructions to the instruction set of the main processor. And since it's microcoded, it's faster than software floating point, but it's not as fast as floating point hardware. All of the floating point processors DEC offered previously, which were perhaps better known as floating point accelerators, were multiple printed circuit boards and fairly expensive. So this was DEC's first low-cost floating point hardware, and possibly the first low-cost floating point hardware for any mini computer. So in 1978, AMD introduced what I would consider the first high performance floating point chip, and this was a single precision 32-bit binary floating point unit. It did not use an industry standard floating point format because there wasn't one yet. Although it was only single precision, it included transcendental functions, so that was actually a big selling point. The national chips I mentioned before also did transcendental functions, but of course they were very slow. And the 9511 was much faster, about 50 times faster than those calculator-derived chips. This came about even though it's microcoded. It was designed for the ground up for floating point, so all of its internal data paths are optimized for floating point. And arithmetic functions were usually under 100 microseconds, and basic trig functions were under 2.5 milliseconds. So still slow by 21st century standards, but a big improvement back in 1978. Interfacing was still a little bit tricky. It was NMOS, so the electrical characteristics weren't too bad, but for various reasons, the design of the chip was such that it was moderately difficult to interface to microprocessors. And in fact, AMD published applications information showing what was required to interface to common microprocessors at the time. There were third-party add-on cards for a lot of microcomputers like the Apple II. I'm not aware of any microcomputers that had a socket for a 9511 as standard. And so if you added a 9511 card to your Apple II, then you could load into RAM a modified version of AppleSoft Basic, which was the Microsoft Basic for the Apple II, that would use the 9511 instead of its software floating point. The drawback of that on an Apple II, though, was that software floating point actually was 40-bit floating point that had 9-digit precision. So when you used the 9511 chip instead, you actually lost precision, even though you gained speed. And Intel second sourced that part as the 8231. An Intel spokesman once famously said that the biggest innovation that AMD ever had was cloning Intel, but this is an example of Intel licensing an AMD design. Of course, more recently, that happened, and in a more important fashion, when Intel adopted the AMD 64-bit extension to x86. So 2 years later, AMD introduced another chip, the 9512. Now, as I mentioned, the IEEE standard was not actually ratified till 1985, but the 9512 chip used the draft IEEE standard as well, because even in 1980, it was obvious that the world was going to go to IEEE floating point. So as far as I know, the chip design internally is quite similar to the 9511, and that meant that the performance might not be optimal for IEEE, and also they added double precision to this chip, which the 9511 didn't have. But as a consequence, they didn't have room in the microcode for the transcendental functions. So this chip only does arithmetic, not transcendentals. It does include integer conversions, which is quite useful. The 9511 chip had those as well. It's still NMOS, but it's slightly easier to interface to the 9511. With the benefit of experience, they saw what some of the difficulties were with the 9511 and improved them. And this one was also second sourced by Intel as the 8232. So we get to 1980, the Intel 8087 mentioned previously. Completely glueless interface to the 8086 or 8088. No added circuitry of any kind was necessary. It basically all the signals on the 8087 socket were just wired to the corresponding signals on the 8086 or 8088 socket. So very easy to use with those Intel main processors. On the other hand, compared to the previous chips, this one was difficult to use with any other main processor because it was only intended for use with the 8087. It's purpose-built for IEEE floating point. Used what Intel called HMOS, which was NMOS but higher density than normal NMOS. Really all NMOS went that way, but this was a case where Intel was in the lead in process technology. It had microcode, and unlike everything previously mentioned, the microcode ROM actually stored 2 bits per memory cell. It was, as far as I know, the first chip to ever do that. Modern NAND flash stores 2 or 3 or even 4 bits per cell, but this was the first chip that did that. It was the fastest floating point chip at the time. An addition typically took about 17 microseconds. This is on a 5 megahertz chip. They actually offered faster ones later. Single precision multiplication, 19 microseconds, double in 27. And then it only had a limited number of trig functions, but it could do a tangent in about 90 microseconds. That was just blazing fast at that time. So, to sum things up, the evolution of floating point hardware and general purpose computers, the 1940s through 1960s, floating point was actually a standard feature of a lot of big computers. 60s through 70s became optional on some computers, but it was expensive still. Mid-70s, we started to see floating point coprocessors based on microcontrollers, really based on calculator chips, which are microcontrollers. Late 70s through 1980s, purpose-designed floating point coprocessors, so higher performance. And then 1990s to present, floating point went back to being a standard feature on microprocessors. So it's really, there's almost no cases today where floating point is optional. Microcontrollers often do not have it, but it's not something that can be that is normally added on with another chip. If you want a microcontroller with floating point, there are some that you can buy. So that's the end of the presentation. I will open things up to questions.
Thanks, Eric. I think everybody should be able to open ask questions. Come off mute if you want to.
This is Gene. I remember in 1984 having a 8088 or 8086, probably 8088 computer doing Lotus 123, one of the early spreadsheets before Excel. And it had a ton of just plain multiplication, division, and so on being done that took forever. I think you had to hit F9 for it to start calculating. And it would just sit there flashing red, wait, whatever. So I convinced the people that owned the business to buy an 8087, pop the thing in, and it was amazing because then it would only flash for 2 or 3 seconds. So I don't know that later on in the 386 world, you could get a 387 chip and pop it in. I don't know that math coprocessors seemed to help as much later. Maybe the standard processor was faster at the time, but I do know in the 8088 world, it was an amazing difference being able to pop in a chip, even for just multiplications and additions and things like that.
Hey, Eric, you didn't mention the 8386. I recall that it used an 8287 coprocessor. Remember that and what the difference was between that and the 8087?
Oh, the 386 could use a 287, but there was a 387, and generally it just continued the trend of making the floating point performance higher. There were significant differences between the 8087 and the 287, mostly in terms of better compliance with the actual ratified IEEE standard. So as Gene said, for spreadsheets that did improve the performance a lot, but he didn't see as much improvement when he had a 386. And part of the reason for that may be that when Excel appeared and ultimately took over the spreadsheet world, Excel, for the same reason that calculators don't use binary floating point, Excel didn't use binary floating point either. Excel implemented decimal floating point in software so that you wouldn't have the rounding problems trying to represent negative powers of 10 and such. So I gather that there have been some versions of Excel that could be configured to actually use the host binary floating point, but normally they do not.
Thank you.
Also around that time, the floating point became standard in what was the DX, and you have to buy the special SX that had no floating point built in.
Right, and it's an interesting point because the die still had the floating point. It was just disabled.
Right.
There was a lot of talk on the internet about, that they used rejects for that, and to the best of my knowledge, that was never done. That they didn't have reject parts and sell them as down spec parts. I mean, that may have happened for some other things, mostly memory, but I think that's rarely, if ever, happened on processors. What happened is testing a microprocessor is an expensive process. There's a like a Genrad tester machine, a machine that costs hundreds of thousands of dollars, and it tests parts one at a time on the assembly line. So Intel or whatever manufacturer would have had more than one of these, but that's any amount of time that the chip has to spend in that tester being tested costs them money because all the chips have to funnel through there. And so if a chip spends 15 seconds in a tester versus 8 seconds in the tester, that literally impacts the bottom line of the chip manufacturer. So if they can sell you a part that the floating point has not been tested and has been disabled, then the test time is lower, and so even though it's the exact same die, the cost is lower. And so I believe that was what was going on with the 486SX. But the interesting part was, unlike the earlier processors, you could add a floating point coprocessor to it, but that coprocessor that Intel sold you, it was called a 487. It was really a 486 with a different pin out. And when you plug that into your computer that had a 486SX main processor, what it did is it disabled that main processor and it just completely took over. So in that sense, although you could view functionally that, I plugged it in, it's a floating point coprocessor, really you were just replacing the processor.
At the time, Intel shared some information that basically said it was far cheaper for them to make the same die disabled because the QA process only had to make them test the disabled part rather than retest a whole new die. So,
That's right.
They were pretty opaque about the whole thing, though.
Yeah, I mean, semiconductor vendors are generally tight-lipped about anything that involves their processes as it would impact their bottom line. I mean, they were tight-lipped about it, but it was kind of an open secret. Everybody knew or could figure out what was going on, especially their competitors. It was not rocket science. So the competitors all did basically the same thing.
Sounds a bit like the Casio calculator that my mates had at school. I remember one of them spent the extra money for the one that had got the 4 extra labels printed on the shifted functions. And then the other guys found out that the same functions still worked. It's just there were no labels on the keyboard.
Yeah, and today, if you look at the range of Casio scientific calculators, they make multiple models that have identical hardware. They have different labels printed on them, and they have different firmware loaded. So so the manufacturing cost is the same, but you pay more to get the calculator that has more functions. And in some cases, Casio's moved away from this since it was found out. But in some cases, you could open it up. Actually, there was the same firmware in different models. You could open it up and jumper a couple of pins together and turn your lower end calculator into a higher end calculator.
Yeah, I seem to recall my mates did that by taking an indelible pen and just writing the labels on the keyboard. Anyway, from YouTube, Martin, I don't know how you say that. Hepel? I'm not sure. What about Vitek, is it? Or coprocessors existed for some PCs, such as the HP Vectra RS20, but were never very popular. Do you know that?
Yeah, in order to keep the talk short, I originally wrote up a outline for what I was going to talk about, and I included a lot of things that I had to cut for brevity. The Webex chips are one of those. Webex was an early maker of general purpose floating point chips, and most of their chips met the IEEE standard. But they were dedicated hardware, even more so than the AMD 9511 that I mentioned or the 8087, and they were optimized for very high performance. So only a few clock cycles to do a floating point add or a floating point multiply, and since they were very general purpose, they weren't as much designed to tie to a specific chip, like an 8086. But their original chips, you had to buy a separate chip for an adder and for a multiplier. So later, they had combined chips that could add and multiply. And later than that, they had some that had additional functions and that actually were intended to interface to the x86. So yeah, I didn't mention them. I don't know all that much about them. There's some information about those on the internet. Actually, when I was at university, we used some of those early Waytec chips. Waytec was actually founded by some ex-Intel employees. They left Intel to go make higher performance floating point because Intel apparently was not very interested in that market at the time. So their big customers early on were companies that were making floating point accelerators and vector processors that were for use with big mini computers like VAXs. And the microcomputer market was kind of a small potatoes for them early on, but increasingly became of interest to them. And so, as I said, they did ultimately introduce some parts for the x86. The interesting thing about it is that they did not, although they made parts that would plug into certain PC motherboards like that Vectra that was mentioned, they provide high performance floating point, but it was not actually compatible with the Intel floating point processors. It did not use the same instructions. So you actually needed special software to take advantage of those chips, whereas if you put an 8087 or 287 or 387 into your PC, then there was a vast amount of PC software that knew how to use it.
Eric, as a big 71B fan, for years I read, the journal and so forth, talking about the role of IEEE 754 in the 71B, and it inferred that HP was a major player in the development of that. Is that correct, or did they just contribute to what Intel was the main thrust on?
I think it. I'm not really familiar with the history. I suspect that HP was heavily involved in the development of the 854 radix independent floating point. I don't know how much they participated in 754, although they probably were involved in that as well. If you look in the actual standards, which I don't happen to have at hand at the moment, but they generally list the representatives of various companies that were involved in developing the standards. So if you look at those standards, that'll give you some idea as to the involvement.
Thanks.
So Eric, are you aware of what companies like NVIDIA does on their graphics processors? Are they, how do they implement numerical processing?
Well, they have they have a lot of dedicated hardware that does highly efficient implementations of IEEE floating point, and these chips for a long time only did single precision floating point. And when they started offering double precision, that usually had much lower performance. But the interesting trend there is although all the new chips do support double precision, and for some, that's not used a whole lot typically for graphics. It's usually used for other types of computing, going to double precision. But the new trend in them is to offer half precision, and the rationale there is that they can do half precision. For instance, in a vector unit, you can do twice as many operations per cycle, and no, you don't get the precision, but what you get is is just increased throughput. And it turns out that for machine learning, for artificial neural networks, that half precision is good enough. And this has started appearing now in general purpose processors as well. The latest Intel AVX sort of stuff includes half precision now.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Rick, there's Apple and various other people make a big deal about these AI chips that they're putting in. Does that include that type of half precision floating point type function? Do you know? Is that the sort of thing? I've not looked into what they contain, or if did they even tell you what they contain? I'm not sure.
I haven't either. I suspect that they probably do have the half precision, or there are actually some alternative floating point formats that are not IEEE compatible that kind of have variable precision depending on the exponent, and there's some advantages to that, and they might be using that. So this really came to the forefront. There were other things in the market, but this really came to the forefront when Apple put AI coprocessor capabilities into their new M1 chip that's used in the latest MacBook and Mac Mini, and I think that trend is it's hard to say whether that'll continue forward a lot or whether it's a flash in the pan sort of thing. The processor vendors, try to in general purpose processors add instructions to handle common computational loads, which going forward is going to include this type of processing. So as far as I understand it, in the M1, this AI coprocessor really is kind of a bag on the side sort of thing, and that's not intended as a dig at it, but what it indicates is that they didn't yet think that it was time to just make that a core CPU function, and I think over time. Just as floating point was not really originally a core CPU function in microprocessors, but it has become one. I think the same thing is likely to happen with any AI-oriented sort of up processing. I've taken a few classes in machine learning topics, and I'm far from being an expert at this. So it may turn out that I'm totally wrong, and maybe 30 years from now, your microprocessor chip will actually the actual processor will be a little tiny thing in the corner, and the whole rest of the chip will be special AI processing functions. I have no idea, but the trend historically has really been to add new types of computational functionality to the core capabilities.
Thanks. Eddie, do you want to ask?
I was wondering if you knew that if all the modern all the calculators used today, do they use chips that are on the IEEE 754 standard?
Calculators mostly do not, because they still want to do decimal floating point. And although the 2008 edition of the IEEE standard includes decimal floating point, there's very little hardware in the world that supports it. IBM mainframe computers are really one of the only ones. I've been optimistic that decimal floating point hardware will appear more widely available, but to date that has not happened. And so I think very few, if any, commercial calculators use floating point hardware.
I think the 71B is the only commercial calculator that ever implemented 754, or at least promoted that.
854.
I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
I think you're right. If there's been any other implementation of 854 that is fully standard compliant, I have never heard of it. When HP and the other companies that worked on 854 developed it, I'm sure they all expected that would see more widespread adoption than it has.
Another way to look at it is, how many calculators have you seen answer not a number, right? Only the 71 will do that.
Yeah, not very many. I always think it's amusing when you see errors in websites where they have done some computation and they haven't done proper error handling, and so they'll tell you that some value, maybe the price of something, or there'll be some place where you expect a number and it'll say nan, and that's a result of sloppy programming, just not anticipating that an error could occur. The worst case of that is when you see some like physical sign somewhere that is trying to present information to you, and it'll say nan, and multiple times I've seen this. You can find photos of this on the internet. It's similar to, maybe not quite as bad as when you see a physical sign somewhere that has a Windows blue screen.
Or more disturbingly, I've seen that on a ATM, you know, bank money. Yeah.
Yeah, where you really don't want to see it is on the
No.
glass cockpit avionics. And as far as I know, there aren't any aircraft that the avionics runs Windows. But you know, if that occurs, your blue screen of death might be literal.
Yeah, the word crash is not what you want to hear in those circumstances, is it?
I do have a cartoon somewhere sat in a folder which says, which is a man sat on an aeroplane with the message on his computer saying, "Found new device Boeing 777. Would you like to pair with this device?"
Yeah, Boeing got a waiver on the 787, and I was very disturbed by it. The traditional rules for aircraft design, no non-essential systems can be electrically connected to actual flight support systems. And so historically that meant that if you were on a 737 and watching the in-flight movie, or using an entertainment system, or using back when they had airphones, none of that was in any way electrically connected to the systems that controlled the plane. And Boeing actually got a waiver for that on the 787, and I think that was a huge mistake. And you know, I'm not aware that it's caused any problems since. The justification for it was so that and this has been done on other aircraft, but the justification was so that the in-flight entertainment could show the route and speed and position and so forth. And to the extent that that's a desirable feature, and I'm not saying it's not, but to the extent that it's a desirable feature, that shouldn't have been implemented by combining the buses. There should have been a gateway at one point that was a unidirectional gateway that was physically incapable of passing any information the opposite direction. And they did not do that. So, who am I to say how Boeing should design planes? They're the experts and I'm not, but it just didn't seem right to me. And the 737 MAX debacles, of which there have been multiple, I think show that Boeing management is ignoring engineers and making management decisions that, instead of saying we're going to do the engineering to make the aircraft safe, they're saying the aircraft is safe, so we're going to cut the engineering to save money, and which is the opposite of how things should be run.
Indeed. Right. Thanks, Eric. That was a very interesting talk. We've just got a few minutes left, and I was going to let me see if I can get the slides to work again. Sorry.
I've gotten pop-ups from a couple of people with comments or questions that have popped up on my screen, but when I click over to chat, they are not present. So and they disappear quickly. So I was unfortunately not able to answer those specific comments.
That's curious. Okay. Thanks, Eric. Vlodek, you want to cover? Or shall I cover? I don't mind. If Vlodek's still there. I'll go. Right, so we're just the final few minutes. Thank you to our two presenters, Eric and Cyril, who unfortunately has left, but we just wanted to bring up a few club things. So we have had a bit of a disaster. We were custodians of the UPLE European programs. Unfortunately, the person that they were entrusted to, their family had a tidy out, and we've lost them. And so I wondered whether anybody who's joined us, particularly people in Europe, whether anybody's got any copies of any UPLE programs that they could perhaps scan, that they could share, and they could become part of our collective archives. Eric's one perhaps at hpcalc.org, or on the museum site. I think it'd be great if we could try and recover some of those programs, but it depends whether anybody has got any of those. If you have, let us know. Vlodek's suggested that we perhaps have another conference as we're still locked down. We normally hold our HPCC conferences once a year, so this is a big one followed by a mini so far in the last 6 months. There is a proposal that we run another session, maybe a mini like this one, maybe a big one if we get enough offers of talks. But if you, and we're thinking about the 10th of April, so the second Saturday in April. If you would like to offer a talk, if you have something that you'd like to present to us, then it would be great to hear from you. If you could send your talk offers to conference@hpcc.org, that would be great. Our next online meeting, regular club meetings, we have them every second and fourth Saturday of the month. Everybody's welcome to join. Obviously, if you'd like to be an HPCC member, receive our club magazine, we'd love you to join as well. That'd be great. But at the moment, we're allowing just any calculator fans to come on to our regular club meetings. So if you drop us an email and let us know if you'd like to join those. We are limited by absolute numbers, but we haven't yet reached that number. So that offer stands. I think that's it. Vlodek, if you're still there.
Still here.
Do you want to say anything?
I've turned my microphone on.
Oh, well done.
Yes. Just when you asked me before, I said thank you very much, everybody, and then I realized I was mute. One thing about UPLE, the person who had them actually had the best programs. What we did was we got 30 boxes, I think, of programs, and we went through them all and picked the nicest ones, and he said, "Ooh, I'll look after those, and I'll provide copies to anyone who wants them." And the other 29 boxes are still sitting in my attic. Of absolutely amazing programs, but of much less interest. There's someone who wrote an operating system for the HP41. It's called TOS, the Tiny Operating System. That sort of thing is still sitting in my attic, and what we need is someone who can scan them. I've had offers from the US, but I don't really want to send boxes and boxes of valuable programs to the US. So that's something to do in England, Britain, or Europe. But we have lost the most valuable ones. Other than that, thank you, everyone. I do hope that we'll carry on with these, but we were hoping for 3 talks today, and we only got 2 by twisting Eric's and Cyril's arms. So maybe we won't have another one for a while. If we do, then probably September, because that's when we have a conference every year.
Yep.
Thanks very much. Over to you, Mark, for final words. Thank you very much, Mark, for running this.
That's it for today. Thank you very much, folks. I'm glad you. Hopefully, you enjoyed that. We had, as far as I could tell, 38 people on Webex, 54, I think, on YouTube with the maximum numbers I saw. So good turnout. And if you would like to join us for just a regular club meeting, then the next one is in 2 weeks' time. Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Thanks, guys, for hosting us.
Thanks a lot. I really appreciate this.
Thank you. Have a great, safe couple of weeks, everyone. See you in 2.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Mark, have you copied the whole of the chat?
I will before I shut it down. Yeah, absolutely.
Someone's just sent me a question.
Oh.
So I need to answer them before we go down. If he's still there. It was Eddie Shaw.
I can only see public chat.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
That's why I'm concerned, because it won't be saved in the public chat.
No. Ooh, actually, I wonder if I could. Yeah. I think I can only see public chat.
Edward Shaw. Is he still here? No, he's not.
Oh, he's left already. Yeah.
He's left.
No,
all right.
but he's on the regular meetings.
Yeah, okay, so I can tell him then.
Yeah.
On
the HPCC 4.9. Yeah.
Yes,
I found
that's the one.
any news on the HPCC 4.9.
If anyone's interested, I can tell you the sad story. the HPCC 4.9G was a joke calculator made using blue cheapo little keyring calculators, and the companies that make them have stopped making blue ones. They're making other colors. So I was going to make something called the G2 in different colors using the same models, but in fact they no longer stand up vertically. And Bob Prosperi has sent me a box full of sideways opening ones which open like a book, and I think I might use those instead. So I'll let you know of progress as it goes. Thanks. And Mark has put the manual for the HPCC 4.9G on our website, but you haven't actually got a link to it, so nobody knows how
I
to
haven't got a
find it.
link to it. I'll put it in the chat. There you go.
Okay, thanks.
Apologies for that.
No, no problem. It's just I'm wondering whether you'd put it sometime on the website itself.
I will. Now you've reminded me, I will. Yeah.
Okay, that was all. Thanks very much. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, guys. Take care.
Take care, everybody. Hope to see you physically sometime. Okay. Bye.
Okay, guys, thanks.
Thanks.
See you in 2 weeks.
Yes.
I'm off as well. See everybody next time.
See you guys.
Yes. Good luck,
All
Goodwin.
good. All good on the stream. The stream looked all right, didn't it? Were you recording separately as well?
Yes, I have been. So I will
Yeah.
cut the two
Brill.
talks individually and post those separately.
Excellent. Thanks.